Welcome to Electric Evolution with Liz Allan. This podcast is about the journey to a more sustainable future in order for us to be able to do our bit to achieve net zero. I'll be discussing a variety of topics with experts in their field in order to educate and increase our knowledge of clean energy, electric vehicles and the electric vehicle infrastructure. So whether you're an individual wanting to make a difference at home, a small business or a corporate, this podcast is just for you. On the podcast today, I have got a chap who's out in Australia. So I've got Johan Karlsson from Enter, based in Melbourne, Australia. Johan, thank you ever so much for joining me on this podcast. It's really great to have you on here.
Thank you, Liz. Great to be on.
And I'm going to tell everybody, for those that can see him, if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see this, but I'm going to tell you for those that you're listening, Johan's the very first person I've ever had an interview with whilst he's sat in a Tesla. It's amazing. I love it.
I figured it would be maybe something a bit different. I figured I'll take my laptop, take my podcast lighting and camera and mic and set it up in here and just have a bit of the Tesla in the background.
I love it. Because we were just saying, so Johan also runs, this is not what we're going to talk about, but he also runs a podcast as well. So it's got all the glam lighting and everything, haven't you? So you're looking marvellous on there at your end.
Thank you. Thank you. And hopefully I can learn a little bit about professional podcasting as well from you, Liz.
I'm not quite sure about that, love. But we shall see. I just as everybody will have been listening and watching for a while, they know that I just wing it. Anyway, right, let's get down to explaining what you do. So you are managing partner of Enter, based in Melbourne. Now, a chap called Alan O'Donnell from Easy over in the UK introduced us, didn't he? And he basically messaged me to say that you would be able to open my eyes to the Australian EV market and kind of EV charging. So that's kind of why we started talking. So can you just give me a little bit of your background? So you're managing partner at Enter. There's something else that you do that I'll talk about in a minute as well. But what is your background? Why are you doing what you do currently?
Sure. I mean, as you can probably hear from my accent, I'm not originally from Australia. I'm from Sweden. And I probably have the most common Swedish name, Johan Karlsson. And about 16 years ago, I was out traveling. At the time, I sort of had left high school. I had a year or two of working because I didn't know what I wanted to study at uni. So I went out traveling, went to Australia amongst other places. And whilst I was in Australia, I was introduced to a university in Brisbane, and I just thought to myself, heck, I might just move to Australia. I might just, I still don't know what I want to study, but I'll go to Australia, I'll study there, I'll study business to start with. And then a couple of years in, they introduced a major in sustainability, which is really when it's all clicked for me. All of a sudden I can kind of apply a lot of, I guess, analytical thinking to things that I really cared about. This was kind of in the early days of emissions trading schemes and what they call the carbon farming initiative in Australia. So I started as a consultant in that space out of uni, and then started working actually a couple of years later for a company more on the energy efficiency side of things, working in industrial energy efficiency. I did a little bit of engineering studies on top of that, which then took me into the broader kind of field of energy, and probably more so on new energy or energy solutions, meaning things like solar PV, energy storage, e-mobility, those kind of areas. So I've probably spent for the last 10 years or so, I've spent across energy retail, consulting, and then working for a few startups as well. And so in the last few years, I've worked, had my own consulting firm that I've ran for about 3 years or so, that I recently left last year to then start a new consulting firm called Enter. And so Enter is very much focused on the e-mobility transition in Australia and New Zealand. very much focused on learning from some of the leaders in Europe. So it's great to be on a podcast with you, who's based in the UK, being right in the middle of the EV transition.
It's a massive big transition happening currently, isn't it, across the world. What does it look like currently? I mean, you kind of just said then that you're looking at the UK and Europe as kind of like the leaders. It's funny, before we started talking, I was kind of thinking that, oh, surely Australia must be miles ahead, because if you look at, your the way that the weather out there, for a start off, I can imagine renewables will be massive. And I suppose in my thinking, I was kind of thinking, well, surely, like you said, it kind of goes hand in hand with e-mobility, that should be flying ahead as well. Is that not the case currently?
No, we have a bit of a disconnection, unfortunately, between renewable energy and e-mobility, I'd like to say. If we look at residential homes, they've done a tremendous job. And for homes in Australia, a huge amount. I think the number is about 34 or 35% of all homes in Australia have rooftop solar, which is incredible, the highest in the world by far. So homes are definitely doing a lot of that heavy lifting. And interesting, just as a sidebar, for people that have an EV, the likelihood of also having solar is about 60 or 70%, because of course a lot of us are early adopters as well. But yeah, if we look on the other hand, we look at e-mobility and electric vehicles. For last year, or rather for 2022, we were only sitting at about 3% of all new car sales being electric.
Right.
Last year, luckily, we're starting to hit reasonable numbers. We're sitting at 7.2, so more than a doubling. So we're really starting to kind of hit that beginning of the hockey stick. But yeah, as you know, if Nordics in particular, where I'm from, Sweden and Norway are doing some incredible numbers. Often sitting in the 40-50% for Sweden, 80s and even 90s for Norway. So we're really lagging behind as far as electric vehicles are concerned.
So just tell me then, so what is it that you're trying to do with Enter then? So just give us a little bit of background to why you started Enter and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So Enter, what we try to do really is we try to help companies that are leading this transition. Technology companies often, could be electric vehicle charging manufacturers that are at the very forefront in the world. Again, in particular, the Nordics have some incredible hardware manufacturers. Some of those companies might not have understood the opportunity of being in Australia and New Zealand. And so what we try to do is really try to highlight the opportunity that's coming. The fact that it's a very sizable car market. The car market last year was 1.2 million vehicles sold in Australia, which is more than the Nordics combined. So when you start, kind of going from, last year, say 7%, hopefully this year we might hit 15%. And, before you know it, we'll be up in the 30s, 40s, and perhaps catching up with some of the northern parts of Europe. So I think what we really try to do is make it easier for them to understand the market opportunities, what competitors might be doing in the market, and how they can beat those competitors. Because we kind of, we try to work with companies that we think are going to be able to add value and help speed up the transition, because we are far behind. And technology, I think, is part of the solution to kind of help us catch up.
Okay, so do you know what? I've got to ask you this question. I've just written this down while we were talking. How are you what we talk about FUD over here, fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Yeah.
Is that affecting you over in Oz?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the interesting thing about our car market is, if you look at the top 3 vehicles sold out of all cars in the market, those 3 vehicles are Ford Ranger, Mitsubishi Triton, and the third car is another utility vehicle. So we're talking the type of vehicles that perhaps a tradie would use, a carpenter, or an electrician, but perhaps even more oversized than what it needs to be. So there's a little bit of perhaps sort of macho kind of attitude in the car space, a little bit Americanized sort of adoption of vehicles. And I think with that comes some of that kind of language that we perhaps will, might expect to see in the US. Perhaps not as bad, but yeah, a lot of people sort of might talk about electric vehicles as, you're taking away the ability to enjoy the weekend, to go away with your camper van out in the bush, not being able to go out, four-wheel driving, that kind of thing, which, to be fair, has some validity, in particular because we've had a market that's been lacking a fair bit of supply. We certainly think there's a lot of demand in the market for EVs. But I think if we look at last year, it might have been about 60 models available in Australia,
Right.
which, compared to, I would imagine in the UK, it would have a couple of hundred at
It's
least.
increased a lot. Yeah.
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 So both the number of vehicles available and the volumes available is quite different. But luckily, I know we'll touch on perhaps on policy a little bit later, but I think we're starting to get a little bit more support, and finally Australia next year will get a new vehicle emissions standard put in place, meaning that
Right.
we'll actually, as a manufacturer of cars, you'll have to meet a particular average threshold in order to sell cars in the market. Otherwise, you'll be penalised.
I was going to ask, yeah, I was going to ask you that. In fact, I was just going back to what you said about the size of the vehicles. I was talking to somebody recently who was in Dallas, Texas, a couple of weeks ago, and she basically said there was these massive big trucks, and one of the wing mirror was the size of her head. Do you know
Yeah.
what I mean? It was just ginormous.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I suppose I didn't think that those were the sizes of car that in Australia would be going for. But I suppose there's more SUV size that seems to be coming over here to the UK. But I don't know whether it's and you can tell me what you think about for Australia. I don't know whether it's what people are wanting, or it's just because the OEMs are trying to adopt what America has.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I think here it's a little bit of a combination of probably looking at what America's doing. I think Australia has often looked at our brothers in the US and what they might be doing, and we don't have perhaps the same sized vehicle or sort of monster truck kind of Rams, and although
Good.
we are starting to get some, they're slightly smaller, but I think a big driver of it has actually been government policy that's been unfortunately put in the wrong place. I don't know how long ago, it might have been 10, 20 years ago, there was a policy that gave tax benefits for cars that were used in your workplace, and in particular angled at tradies, or carpenters, and the like. And so automatically it became very cheap to actually lease these quite expensive vehicles for people. So I think that was part of it. Luckily, though, from last year, the same now applies to electric vehicles if you get those on
Right.
an novated lease.
Yeah.
So in my case, we're actually, funnily enough, on our third electric car. We started off with having a Hyundai about four, almost 5 years ago, a Hyundai
Yeah.
Kona,
Yeah.
which is a great car.
They
Loved
are.
it.
Yeah.
Although we did have some issues with that, we had to replace the battery. But I think some of those cars that are perhaps not built on a 100% electric platform can sometimes have some of those teething issues. We then swapped to Model 3, which we again also loved. But about a year into owning the Model 3, there came this new tax benefit on novated leases for electric cars, and it was actually cheaper for us to sell the Model 3 outright and get a novated lease with a Model Y. And I think I'm I'm an energy nerd. I love kind of living this EV and energy transition myself. But I think it's a really, really good incentive, I think, for people to getting into electric cars, is to have some of these incentives from government.
I totally agree, and I really, really hope that the UK turns it around a bit, because actually, we've not really got any incentives to buy EVs anymore at the moment of recording this. Whether this changes over the next few months, I don't know. And
Yeah,
also, we're in an election year as well in the UK, so things are
yeah,
always up and in the air, and you don't always know what's going on a kind of in an election year. I was going to ask you, so when is
yeah.
the ban for combustion engine vehicles? Is there a date? Is there a date for the ban on combustion engines?
Listen, I really hope that we would have a date on that. I think, unfortunately, Australia does really lag behind as far as policy policy introductions. As I said, we're just next year in 2025 will be the second last country in the world to get an emission standard.
Oh,
I
is
think it's
this what
only
you
Russia left
right?
now after us,
Yes, I
and
get you.
so so I so I think so what that will do is it will start forcing the sort of average portfolios of manufacturers to become a lot more a, a lot less emissions intensive, and by the mid 2030s, it looks completely different to what it does now. I don't remember the numbers exactly, but there's a big reduction in emissions, but unfortunately no ban in place. But I would imagine with a lot of the other markets moving aggressively on the fossil fuel ban, that should have impacts in Australia too.
Anything like this takes time, though, doesn't it? And like you say, hopefully once the standard comes in, then that's when you I suppose it's about having a benchmark, isn't it? It's what you benchmark where you are now and where you want to get to in future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if we look at where we are now in Australia, believe it or not, but we're paying about 20% more for petrol compared to Americans.
Gosh.
That's how much less efficient our cars are here. Australia really has been the dumping ground of some of these fossil hungry vehicles, and it's really about time we're getting this policy in place, and then from there we can start hopefully improving quickly and shake off that reputation, and really start moving in the right direction. Because as you say, if we look at Australia as a country, in terms of resources, there's a lot of sun, there's a lot of wind resource, there's a lot of underutilized hydro resources. Offshore wind is starting to happen as well across the country, and
Okay.
so we'll start having the right kind of fuels to put in those cars.
Yeah, exactly. What's the charging network like then currently? How is it growing at the moment for you?
So it's certainly growing quickly and at an accelerated pace. We see we essentially we've had two charging networks outside of Tesla that are really starting to take shape across the country. Particular one that's called ChargeFox, another one's called EV Networks. They would both have a few hundred DC charging stations under their belts. They've both built charging networks that connect all the major cities, in particular on the East Coast, where most of the population is. So the experience for someone that lives like me, live in Melbourne, if I want to go up to say Sydney, which is probably 10 to 12 hours of driving away, that's a trip I can do, and take half an hour stops along the way, and it's a good experience. We've certainly had some issues with some of those private networks with hardware, some hardware faults.
Yes.
I think, and you probably have that same experience in the UK, right?
Yeah.
That it's not that smooth, and you're kind of trying to figure out how do I create something that's cost effective, something that has a really good asset management plan along the way, and all the right incentives are with the right players. I think one thing that we've really seen here is that one of the networks did have quite a lot of those DC fast chargers owned by site hosts that might not have the same kind of incentives to, keep stock of spare parts or immediately respond to issues. And so, compared to the other charging network, which instead owned the infrastructure themselves, and therefore for them uptime was absolutely critical to ensure that they get the revenue they expect. So I think really thinking about how you manage those assets and how that flows on to the customer experience, and therefore kind of the whole electric vehicle transition as a whole, because if it doesn't work well for you as a consumer, it's going to be a negative experience. You're going to talk about that negative experience, and that going to create a sort of negative sentiment for many people. So it's important to get it right.
Yeah, I was gonna say that is we find in the UK a lot of people are hearing things about the charging network, not necessarily the EVs themselves, although there was this whole, batteries are going to explode and this, that, there was a fire at Luton Airport, and even though it wasn't to do with EVs, it was still named, there were so many conspiracy theorists out there, about, it's all a hoax and all this kind of stuff. But, hopefully that's all of us across the world, people start recognizing that actually they're not as bad. EVs aren't as bad. The charging network isn't as bad, etc., etc. I was gonna ask you. So what are there? Is it for EV charging in Australia and New Zealand, or do you want me to just? Are you mostly concentrating on Australia, or is New Zealand in this kind of? Is the charging in New Zealand similar to what's happening in Australia?
We certainly spend most of our time on Australia, but we in particular have a partner that we work with for New Zealand.
Okay.
But briefly just on their transition, it looks completely different to Australia.
Does it?
They have adoption rates of EVs, I think in the 20s
Do they?
in terms of
Blimey.
percent.
Yeah.
And really, it's also very easy to see why they've been successful. To date, they've had a really supportive government, and it's been bipartisan. They've adopted a lot of the similar policy to Norway, who also had a very supportive and I think stable electric vehicle policy.
Yeah.
They've had that going for them. They also open up the possibility to import electric vehicles from Japan, so grey market imports, and had a really, really high take up of old Nissan Leafs and other Japanese cars actually drive pretty considerable volumes. And so it's really interesting to see how well they've done in New Zealand. We can actually learn a fair bit from them too, even though it is a much smaller market than Australia. It's I think in terms of car sales, it's maybe 150,000 cars per year compared to 1 to 1.2 million. So it's not huge, and it's obviously a very different type of landscape where they have a lot of hydroelectricity, but much smaller, and very, very high levels of clean energy, which is also great. So kudos to our neighbours in New Zealand.
So yeah, I suppose actually it's interesting to hear what you're saying about the differences between Australia and New Zealand. And actually, like I say, I didn't realise about either of these. You know how it's all working out. If we just kind of, you were talking about for Australia the Tesla supercharger network, or we just talk about EV charging. So actually, if you could compare EV charging in Australia to EV charging in New Zealand, and what coverage are we talking about? You know, are we talking about in Australia it's small pockets of charging around the main cities? And is it the same in
Yeah,
New Zealand? Is that what it's looking like?
I would say that perhaps the experience in New Zealand is that over there it's not an issue generally, except for perhaps some peak periods. It's not an issue to find a really fast DC fast charger. You'll find them along the highways every 30, 50 kilometers, and there's quite a few charging networks, and a lot of that build out has been supported by government to get
Yeah,
to that
that's good.
stage. Whilst in Australia, we have had some support from ARENA, which is the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, have supported a couple of those charging networks to really create the corridors between the big cities. As you know, Australia is very vast, and
Yes.
so here we might instead have charging stations perhaps at 200 kilometers spacing. So it's certainly not easy when you start getting out of those metropolitan areas to find charging. And I think for someone like me, we do a lot of work in the AC space, and the beautiful thing about home charging and charging at work is that it's always charged up when you're ready to go, whether you're going to work in the morning or whether you're going back home in the afternoon. I think that's really where a lot of the convenience lies in terms of everyday life. But I think looking at looking at some of those leaders, I talk here to the Nordics and Sweden and Finland, Sweden and Norway in particular. I think what you find there is really this diversity in charging. You find chargers built into your parking meter. You find them built into power poles, and you find them in all sorts of places, shopping centers,
Do.
and it's typically it's easy to use. Sure, you need to have get the 20th app perhaps, but it's
Yeah,
generally
you know it.
yeah. And that's maybe a question for you. Is that something that how many apps do you have on your mobile, and what's the
Oh
experience
my
like
God.
in the UK?
Do you know what? I reckon, just quickly looking now, so 18,
Oh
27,
my, no.
36. I've got over 40 apps on my phone for charging.
Wow. That
No.
is kind of crazy. And
There's a
I
lack
mean
of
that's not a good
standardization.
yeah, that's not a good experience, right? And I think we had a bit of we had some discussions about this recently in the industry, and I think there's kind of two camps. There's one which is let's open up roaming as much as possible. Let's make it easy to kind of bridge the gap, and let's minimize the number of apps. And then I think there's the other purists that are more, let's make sure there's a credit card reader on every single EV charger out there. Which and I kind of agree with both points. I think we really should make it easier for customers. You shouldn't have to have 40 apps. I think in my case, I have three. We're not as far advanced as you guys in terms of our EV charging infrastructure, which I probably blame for most of that. But yeah, we shouldn't have to have more than three. I really don't think so.
You're right. Absolutely right. And I think, yeah, so we have got some public charging regulations that came in last November, and by November this year, all chargers, I think it's over a specific speed, and I can't remember offhand what that is. They've all
Hmm.
got to be contactless.
Yeah.
But then
Yep.
further down the line, there's issue. There's things on these public charging regs with roaming and things like that.
Hmm.
I suppose what I'd say with regards to, yes, 40 apps is ridiculous, isn't it? You know, they're not necessarily, they'll probably say there's probably about 35 that are charging. There's other things in there as well, but that's all to do with EV charging. I've spoken to a number of people about standardization of apps so that, or like you say, I suppose, you know, if you think about a television, and I'm sure, you know, you can have universal TV controllers, you know, that'll work on any telly. Do you know what I mean? And I suppose in my mind is it would be great if there was, you know, I'm going to quote Lord of the Rings, but it's slightly one app to rule them all. It's kind of it's kind of something like that we could do with having, but I get why we need contactless, but I also get why companies want apps, because once you have contactless, they've got no information about those customers, have they? You know, they're literally just tapping and going. So there's no way that you can reach out to those customers. You're not building a relationship with them. I suppose I was talking to somebody about the similarities between, or the lack of similarity between, the petrol station, you know, scenario, going to fill a car up with fuel and just going in, tapping your card and just going. There's no relationship there. Whereas, you know, or you go into the kiosk and you pay, but you might buy a bar of chocolate or something, you know, which is usually what I used to do, which is not good. But, you know, but then it's about, there's a potential with EV charging to build a relationship, isn't there?
Yeah, true. And I think maybe that's part of why we haven't been able to create a really good kind of roaming network too, because I think a lot of those companies do want to own the customer experience, do want to own a lot of that customer information and data, and provide them with genuinely good services. And I think that's why perhaps some of them are reluctant to relinquishing that control over what the experience is like, or what that interface is. So it's kind of its own enemy in a sense. But yeah, I do wonder where the sort of, you know, what the best solution is, because it's certainly something. I think as a purely from a consumer perspective, I think being able to pay with a tap and go, whether it's with my mobile or credit card, certainly makes it a lot easier. And perhaps there's a way you can have that experience while still you know, sharing data. Maybe it's part of the plug and charge kind of experience, where we're getting, you know, some of that information built into to the experience too.
Yeah, that, I suppose, do you know what, that makes sense, and it would negate the potential for having to have a multitude of apps as well, wouldn't it? And that, yeah, because like you say, you can create that experience whilst, you know, somebody gets the main thing that I want to see is a seamless service with, you know, with EV charging, a seamless service where you know what you're going to get. You know, I don't want to rock up at a charger.
Yeah, totally.
This is, you know, this is what's happening currently. Sometimes you rock up at a charger and you don't know whether it's going to work or not, or you don't know the speed you're going to get, or this or that, or this or that. You know, I just want a seamless service, and I know lots of other people that do.
Totally, absolutely, and I think it would be great also if we can, you know, as we develop some of those experiences like plug and charge, that we also make sure that we can kind of deliver a similar amount of data exchange from those interfaces. I know for a fact that you know, the sort of the data points you might get when you plug in a DC charger that gets exchanged versus an AC charger is quite different. And I think if, you know, the more data that can be provided about, you know, the state of charge, or the way in which the charge is being handled by the vehicle or the charger, I think the better you can make that experience for the customer. So it's I think in the end, with any type of charging infrastructure, I think keeping the customer as the number one focal point, then really thinking about how to make sure you can either install that charger in a really simple way and making the life for electricians easy, and or how to make, you know, the asset management and the repairability of chargers something that's just second nature, and where we always ensure there's a high uptime.
I was going to say, so you were talking about you work with, your main aim is you're working with AC chargers. What's the percentage? I'm assuming there's a much higher percentage of home charger potential in Australia than there is in the UK, because obviously I don't know the spread of the housing stock and how it works in Australia, but over in the UK we've got lots of little terraced rows of houses where they're all kind of chucked together, and there's not really, and in some cases not really, an inability to actually have a home charger.
Yeah, no, Australia is quite different when it comes to the housing stock and the type of density housing that we do have. So you'll find there's a lot of freestanding houses. People live in never-ending suburbs, and so yeah, that's definitely a factor that's different. I personally think home charging is going to become a lot bigger than perhaps in places like the UK and other parts of Europe. Whilst here, it makes so much sense to have a dedicated home charger in your garage or in your carport, for sure.
Do you want to tell us then? So I'm interested in understanding, who do you want to work with that would be a potential customer for you in the UK out there?
Yeah, sure. I think generally across Europe, we would love to work with any EV charging manufacturer, any software provider in the EV space, and anyone that thinks that perhaps a car market with 1.3 million cars sold per year, where an increasing amount of those being EVs, where we're just at the beginning of that hockey stick curve. I'd love to talk to anyone that has an interest in kind of exploring us as a region. What we can really help companies with is to make that that market entry a lot smoother than what you might have experienced in other places. So we do that by providing a lot of that information and knowledge you might need up front, helping you get you into contact with the right people in the industry, whether that's distribution channels, wholesalers, or retail partners, or even installer networks. So that's kind of what we do. We're all about de-risking and making it easier for EV players and also energy players, but mainly e-mobility players to succeed down under.
Brilliant. And how can people find you? Where can they find you? What's the website? And where are you on LinkedIn? Which I know you are anyway, but is that a good place for people to find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Look for enter with this enter symbol, or look at enter.energy is our website, and you can book an appointment there, or send us a message, or engage in any other way.
Brilliant. So I'll make sure all of that information is in the show notes for you, for everybody to find you. You're on LinkedIn. You've got your own podcast. Remind me what the name of the podcast is.
Yes, we're called Charging Sessions. So we're not a competing podcast, but a complementary one to Liz's. We're just starting out. We've got about 8 episodes so far, and hopefully I can invite you back to join ours one day. That'd be great, Liz.
That would be fantastic. Johan, it's been brilliant having you on here. Thank you ever so much for your time. We've had a few technical difficulties, not quite sure how it'll come across. Hopefully it'll come across well. I'm sure my podcast producer Tom will work his magic on it. But thank you. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Likewise, Liz. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks then. Bye. Bye everyone. Bye. Thanks for watching this episode of Electric Evolution. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons to stay connected with us. And if you're inspired by our journey towards a sustainable future and want to support our mission on a monthly basis, please check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/Electric Evolution Podcast. Your support really helps us to bring the latest insights and discussions in the world of clean energy, electric vehicles, electric vehicle charging and sustainability to you. If a regular subscription isn't what you're looking for, you can always consider buying us a coffee. just head over to www.buymeacoffee.com/Electric Evolution Podcast. Every cup helps us to keep the electric evolution moving forwards. And if you're curious about our work in the EV infrastructure sector at Full Circle Continuous Improvement, why not visit us at www.fullcircleci.co.uk to find out more. And if you want to send me a message, you can always email me on liz@fullcircleci.co.uk. And finally, please don't forget to share this podcast if it sparked your interest. And let's keep spreading the word about all of these topics that we're covering. So, until next time, see you soon. Bye!